Welcome everybody to my video. In this video I'm going to be taking you through how I do my Genestealers for my Tyranids stroke Genestealer cult, and as you can see I like to go for the classic look, reminiscing back from playing Space Hulk. So I base coated my Genestealer in the grey sear from the new Citadel range. So the next step was to, because the model itself is grey, just going over with a white highlight to bring out the higher colours on the actual model itself. Well, when I'm doing this stage, just thinking about where the sun will actually hit the model, the actual natural light. So doing this will then actually create the natural shade already on the actual model itself, which is pretty cool. When airbrushing using any type of paints, I would highly recommend you use some form of dust mask or just something to protect your lungs. With Tamiya paint it can be toxic, it does state it on the bottle itself, but with any paints itself it's not going to be healthy to breathe any of this stuff into your lungs. So next up I'm going to be using French Blue 50/50 with thinner, and then just going to be putting in 2 drops of Intense Blue from Scale Colour, and that's the SC83. All I'm looking to do at this point is just to pick out the high parts of the actual model itself, where the light will be reflecting off the actual skin and off the actual head part of the model. If you would be so kind to consider just hitting that like and subscribe, it does help me out massively, and it does help me going forward, pushing out more content for yourselves to enjoy. Now by hitting that bell, it will notify you of any other content that comes available from ourselves. Next up we're going to be using the blue from the model Vallejo range, and all I'm going to be doing now is just covering the rest of the model that I've missed with the French blue, and this will create a nice definition between the shade and the light parts of the model. So next up we're going to be using base grey sear. Now this is to be used to where I'm going to be applying all the fleshy colours to the actual model itself. Really important that we go back to the base, otherwise if we just leave it blue, the next colour that sits on top won't look as good on the actual model itself. Voluptuous pink from the new contrast range was then used or then applied to all the fleshy parts of the actual model itself. Now this is going to be our base colour for underneath the actual flesh itself. Next up we're going to be using the Cadian flesh tone. Now this was used via an airbrush where I went 50/50 with thinner to the actual Cadian flesh tone. When applying this onto the actual model itself, I made sure that I kept it going at the same angle all the way through. So I'm not looking to cover all the head because I still want some of the voluptuous pink from underneath to actually show up underneath the actual model itself. So the voluptuous pink will be into the recesses and into the shade. And the airbrush itself can give you that cool little texture way of actually applying the flesh tone onto it without going all over the actual model. The Cadian flesh was then used on a wet palette, so just mixing it up with just plain simple water, and that was to create like a milky consistency on the actual palette itself. And now all I'm going to be doing with this is going over several layers over the actual fleshy parts of the model itself. Now the airbrush will pick out some parts of the model itself, but going over the actual brush itself will actually make it stand out a lot more, and it will give a much nicer finish to the actual model. So next up, I will start to use the Salmon Rose to the Cadian flesh, and this is to create a higher mid-tone on the actual fleshy parts itself. Now I went over several times with this just to give it a nice crisp finish, using the hairdryer to dry in between intervals. To create that higher flesh tone, I went in with the Salmon Rose, and this was to go more towards the outlines of the actual fleshy parts itself, and this will help to make the flesh start to pop on the model. As you can see from this video, I've done several passes with the Salmon Rose. The more layers you add on to it, the richer it actually makes the colour on the actual model. Next up, wildwood was then applied to all the bone parts of the model. One of the things I'm loving about contrast at the moment is the rich properties of the actual pigment of the paint itself. As you can see, doing this part, it really does speed this process up really quickly. If you don't actually have any of the contrast paint itself, there's nothing stopping you using a really dark brown, or you could use a dry bark from the GW range, or even the Rhinox hide as well. Still using the contrast paint, just going over the base and getting this prepped and ready for starting to finish off the actual base itself. To pick out the bone parts on the actual top of the forehead of my Genestealer, I just used the wildwood again just to pick those areas out. Wraithbone was then applied to the actual tongue of the actual Genestealer. Next up, I used ivory, and now this was to pick out the highest points of the flesh tones on all of the actual model itself. Using the ivory, it does make the actual flesh itself pop. This is like the final part you do, but this is like the bit that really does make the actual flesh stand out on the model. As you see, I'm applying the ivory to the actual face itself, and then with a damp paintbrush, I'm just helping the actual paints blend in nicely into the actual flesh. And this just kind of gives it that nice transition between the two different colours. So Screaming Skull was then used using a 50-50 with water to create that nice milky consistency on the actual wet palette itself, and then this was applied by several coats onto all the bone areas of the actual Genestealer. Bright white was then applied to all the highest parts of the actual bone. Moonfang Brown was then applied to the base using just a very cheap makeup brush. Steel Legion Drab was then applied to the base itself, and this was just a lighter dry brushing effect over the same area that I've just already previously gone over. Crackstone was then applied, and again just going with a very lighter dry brush over the same areas, still leaving the previous colours showing up underneath. Now for the final part, the Iron Ranch skin was then applied very lightly onto to the highest parts of the base itself. Really important you don't go too heavy with this paint, otherwise it will oversaturate the model. So next up, I'm going to be using the grey sear onto the actual stone part of the model. One thing I like doing is going over grey over brown itself. I find personally it's a much nicer colour to go over than a very dark grey or even a black. It just gets, for myself, it gives a much nicer finish. To start highlighting the actual blue parts of the actual Genestealer itself, went back in with the French blue and then start adding the wolf grey from the Villaggio range, just mixing it in, so 2 parts French blue, 1 drop of grey. Then applying this to the model, I went over several different coats onto the model, each time applying a little bit more grey to the mix itself, just to create that highest point of the highlight. Now to attach the head to the body itself, what I do, I remove all the paint that will be between the head and the actual body itself. Really important that you remove this, so when you use the plastic glue, it just makes that bond a lot stronger. So the final part, just using the Lustrous Pink just on the tongue itself, straight from the pot, and this gives it a really nice effect. Indian yellow was then applied into the eye sockets of the actual model itself, and this will create that nice glow effect coming from the eyes. And that's it, and that's how I do my Genestealers for my Tyranids stroke Genestealer cult. On the tabletop, it is a really stunning, lovely model. It really does make people stop and stare. Just those subtle highlights and the flesh tones really do make the actual model itself pop. Really hoping this video has been useful to yourself and that you've enjoyed it. As I said before, if you haven't already, please do hit that like and subscribe. It does help us out massively, and we really do appreciate it. I'd love to give a massive great shout out and a massive great thank you to all the patrons that we have to the Twisted Dice channel so far. If you would like to help and support us at Twisted Dice, we are on Patreon. From as little as $1 a month, you could help and support the channel grow. For $6 a month, you can get involved and get some cool dice sent out to yourself anywhere in the world. Thank you for watching this video. We really do appreciate it, and hopefully we'll catch you all again soon.